The first thing I noticed was the smell. Stale vent air, laced with burnt coffee, the kind that's been reheated too many times in a communal pot. The hum of the fluorescent lights was constant, a thin, nervous drone that filled the gaps in the room where conversation should have been. Across the table, she sat behind her laptop, the screen angled just enough that I could see my own reflection in the glass. She didn't look up when she said it. "We're letting you go, Thomas. Your way of doing business is outdated. We're going digital first." Her fingers tapped the keys in a steady rhythm, probably logging the details of my exit before I'd even processed the words. Not that there was much to process. I'd seen this coming. Hell, I'd smelled it in the air months ago, the way a storm smells before it breaks. Still, hearing it said out loud felt like watching someone close a door you didn't even realize was behind you. "My name is Thomas Kane. I'm 55 years old, and for the past 25 years, I've been Senior Vice President of Client Acquisitions at Franklin & Moore Capital Partners. Or at least, I was. My division brought in over 86% of the firm's total revenue last year. That's not a guess or a vanity metric. That's hard math. And I did it my way. Face-to-face, contract in hand, the deal sealed with a handshake you could trust. Apparently, that's ancient history now." I watched her glance briefly at her watch before returning her gaze to the laptop, as if the faster she typed, the sooner she could move on to her next task. The faint tremor in her voice when she said "digital first" told me it wasn't her idea. HR doesn't make calls like this without marching orders. Still, she played her part. Cool, efficient, detached. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't plead my case. I just nodded once, slow, like I was filing away her exact words for later. Then I stood, offered my hand across the table. She shook it without meeting my eyes. Her skin was cold. The walk back to my office felt longer than it should have. The carpet muffling each step like the building itself was already erasing me. An intern I barely knew was waiting by my door, a cardboard box in her hands. She couldn't have been more than 22, fresh out of college, wide-eyed, and eager to be helpful. She hovered by my desk as I began packing. Framed photos, a few books, the small brass compass I kept by my monitor. She didn't notice the wall behind me, the one lined with plaques and framed contracts, each one a deal that had kept this place alive during market slumps and economic scares. I remembered the early days, long before titles, before the corner office, before the suits that actually fit. Back when I was just a kid in an ill-fitting blazer, knocking on doors no one wanted to answer, taking meetings in coffee shops at odd hours, because the people I was chasing didn't have time for me otherwise. I learned fast that you don't win deals by spamming inboxes or flooding social feeds. You win them by looking a man in the eye and convincing him without a doubt that you'll protect his money like it's your own. Over the years, that philosophy became my compass. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. I'd flown halfway across the world for a 30-minute lunch just to keep a contract from slipping away. I'd slept on my office couch during the 2008 crash, answering calls from clients at 3 a.m. who were terrified their portfolios were about to vanish. I knew their kids' names, their anniversaries, their fears. That's why they stayed. And now, with one meeting, that entire history was being filed under obsolete. I placed the last folder into the box and closed it. The intern mumbled something about being sorry. I gave her a small smile, the kind you give when you don't have the energy to make someone feel better. Then I walked out. As I made my way toward the elevators, I passed the glass conference room on the east side of the floor. 2 board members were inside, James Porter and Evelyn Cho. I'd closed my first multi-million-dollar deal with James, 15 years ago. Evelyn had fought tooth and nail alongside me during a hostile takeover attempt in '09. They weren't talking. They were just sitting there, pale, tense, their eyes flicking between each other and the tablet on the table. James looked up first, his eyes locked on mine through the glass. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, very deliberately, he mouthed 2 words. "Call me." The elevator doors slid open behind me, but I didn't step inside right away. I just stood there, box in my arms, watching him, until Evelyn noticed and glanced over her shoulder. She didn't mouth anything, but the tightness in her jaw told me enough. Something was wrong. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft hiss. As I descended, I replayed the look on James's face. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even sympathy. It was fear. It was just after midnight when the phone rang. The kind of hour where any call is either a wrong number or trouble. I was sitting in my study with a glass of bourbon, the ice long since melted, a legal pad open in front of me with nothing on it but half a sentence. The number on the screen was one I knew well, Richard Grant, chairman of the board at Franklin & Moore. I let it ring twice before answering. "Thomas, thank God," he said, skipping the usual pleasantries. His voice was tight, ragged around the edges, like he'd been grinding his teeth for hours. "We've got a situation. 3 of our biggest accounts gone. All in the last 48 hours. I didn't ask which ones. I already knew. There were certain contracts that had my fingerprints all over them. Not just in the ink, but in the years of conversations, favors, and quiet handshakes that kept them locked in place. Lose me. Lose them. It was that simple. They're saying the new digital team didn't follow up properly," he went on. "Automated check-ins, canned emails, missed renewal windows. Thomas, these are relationships you built. They trust you. If you could just—" I cut him off before he could finish the plea. "If you dismantle a machine, Richard, you don't get to expect it to run just because you put one bolt back in. You made your choice." Silence. Just the faint sound of his breathing over the line. I could almost hear him calculating how much pride he could swallow before this conversation ended. Finally, he said, "Come in. Consult. Name your price." I took a slow sip of the bourbon, the burn lingering in my chest. Not interested. The truth was, part of me enjoyed hearing the panic in his voice. Not out of spite, though God knows they'd earned it, but because it confirmed what I'd always known. My work wasn't something you could replicate with software or a marketing deck. You can't program instinct. You can't code trust. I thought back to those clients, the ones walking now. I remembered meeting Paul Henderson in a cramped diner outside Pittsburgh during the steel slump of '97. He'd been 3 weeks from bankruptcy, and I'd helped him restructure his investments over coffee that tasted like burnt motor oil. I remembered flying to Zurich on 12 hours' notice when the Lefebvre family thought a bad quarter meant pulling out of U.S. markets entirely. We spent 2 days in a smoke-filled back room of their estate, going line by line through their portfolio until they could breathe again. And there was Samantha Doyle, a hedge fund shark who could gut a room with 1 sentence, but who once called me at 2 a.m, in tears, because she thought she'd lost her father's retirement fund. She hadn't. I made sure of it. These people didn't stick with Franklin & Moore because of the logo on the letterhead. They stayed because when the ground shook, I was the one holding the rope. And now, that rope was gone. Richard tried again. "Thomas, they're talking about pulling the plug on the quarter. If we can't, I'm sure your digital-first strategy will think of something," I said, and hung up. The quiet after was heavy. I topped off my glass, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. That should have been the end of it. But an hour later, my laptop pinged with a single encrypted message routed through a channel I hadn't used in years. No subject line, just an attachment. I hesitated before opening it. Old habits die hard. When I finally decrypted the file, it was a short paragraph, tight, deliberate, the kind of message written by someone who knew every word mattered. HR's golden hires aren't failing by accident. The collapse is deliberate. Valuations being driven down for a private buyout. They've got inside help. Check the contract terminations. Patterns there if you know what to look for. They'll burn it down before they let you save it. No signature, no handle, just the words. I read it twice, then a third time, each pass slower than the last. My eyes lingered on that final sentence. They'll burn it down before they let you save it. It wasn't shock I felt. It was recognition. I'd been in this game long enough to know the difference between incompetence and intent. Incompetence leaves bruises. Intent leaves a body. Somewhere inside Franklin and Moore, someone wasn't just playing a different game. They were rigging the table, and they thought I was out of moves. They were wrong. I didn't walk back into Franklin and Moore's building. That would have been a waste of time and an open invitation for HR to pat themselves on the back about how civil the separation had been. Instead, I went where the real information lived, in the minds of the people who still answered my calls without checking their calendars first. The first stop was a steakhouse in Midtown, dark wood, low light, the kind of place where a good bottle of wine disappears into a deal before dessert. Paul Henderson was already at the bar when I walked in, wearing the same battered leather briefcase I'd seen him carry 20 years ago. We talked about family, markets, a little sports. I let him lead before I started steering. It didn't take long before he mentioned the hiccups in his account. Missed follow-ups, emails from names he didn't recognize, an oddly worded request to update his contact information for digital migration purposes. His voice dropped when he said it didn't feel right. I told him he wasn't imagining things. From there, I moved quickly. Zurich on Tuesday to see the Lefebvre brothers, a flight back Wednesday night to grab lunch with Samantha Doyle at her private club. Then Boston for coffee with two mid-tier institutional investors who still kept their own paper ledgers. Different people, different industries, but the story was the same. Contracts routed through third-party shells to streamline the transition. Confidential data temporarily misplaced during the digital overhaul. Renewal windows somehow slipping into the cracks just weeks before quarterly closes. By the fourth conversation, the shape of it was obvious. This wasn't sloppy work or a system that hadn't been debugged. It was surgical. The timing was too precise, the losses too targeted. The only accounts being mishandled were the ones with the most long-term value, the ones that had been bulletproof under my watch. I've always said selling isn't about the product, it's about the person. In every meeting, I built maps, mental dossiers on tells, hesitations, and pressure points. Paul tapped his ring when he was nervous. Samantha would glance left before she lied about her numbers. The Lefebvres argued more in English than in French when something was urgent. These maps told me where the cracks were and how to seal them before anyone else even noticed. That skill wasn't just for closing deals. It was for moments like this, when you're reading not just the words people say, but the gaps they leave untouched. Each conversation with my old clients left me with a bigger gap to stare at. Who inside the company was orchestrating this, and who stood to gain from dismantling it? I got my first lead from an analyst I'd mentored a decade ago. We met in the corner of a noisy cafe, the kind of place where a conversation could vanish under the hiss of milk steamers and clinking cups. She slid me a folded printout from a public filing that had never actually been made public. Buried in the language was a hint. Shell corporations tracing back to a venture fund managed by a man named Tyler Voss. Voss wasn't just any investor. He was a junior board member at Franklin & Moore, a flashy hire with too much confidence for his experience. And he had ties to acquisition groups that specialized in gutting undervalued firms and flipping their client lists for triple profit. It made sense. Tank the contracts, bleed the numbers, let the valuation crater, and then buy the carcass for pennies. The Golden Digital team was just the distraction. Voss was holding the knife. I didn't tell anyone what I knew. Not yet. This wasn't ready for daylight. I needed the whole picture, not just a name and a motive. So I spent the next week combing through my personal archives. Old contracts, travel itineraries, even dinner receipts. Patterns started connecting in ways the company's sanitized CRM system would never reveal. Client losses lined up perfectly with the formation dates of the shell companies. Every termination notice I saw was issued 3 to 5 days before a quarterly filing, just enough to bury the hit until it was too late for the board to course correct. By the time I reached the last folder, it was well past midnight. My study was lit only by the glow of the laptop and the dim lamp in the corner. The bourbon glass beside me sat untouched. I'd gone past the point of needing it. At 2:14 a.m., I pulled up an archived deal record from 12 years ago. A straightforward renewal with Henderson's firm. Nothing remarkable except for the fact that it had been reclassified in the new system as inactive, without a single note explaining why. I was halfway through cross-referencing it when the screen went black. No warning, no freeze, just gone. Then, a line of text appeared in stark white against the dark. "Stop digging, old man." No signature, no source. I stared at it, my hands still on the keyboard, my reflection faint in the screen. The words didn't threaten me. They confirmed everything. Someone knew I was inside their game now, and they were worried. I didn't back off. I'd spent too many years watching sharks circle to know the difference between a scare-off and an opportunity. They thought they'd warned me away. All they'd done was confirm I was in the right waters. So I started baiting the hook. The plan wasn't complicated, but it had to be precise. I invented a client, one so big, so lucrative, so vulnerable, that no saboteur with a pulse could resist. In my world, you don't dangle a minnow to catch a predator. You throw out a bleeding marlin and let the scent do the work. I gave this phantom company a name, a fake website, a shell email domain, and a profile that would read like gold to someone sniffing for a quick kill. A family-owned global manufacturing chain, in transition, run by heirs who had no idea how to navigate a shifting market. The kind of target that looked like easy prey for a buyout flip. From there, I seeded the story. I staged phone calls in public spaces I knew certain people frequented. Calls just loud enough for someone at the next table to catch phrases like overexposed assets and full-service management deal. I created email threads between me and my contacts that I knew would be intercepted because I sent them from an account I'd already burned years ago. Then I started leaking just enough documents to make it all look real. Doctored financial statements, export agreements with too many redactions to ignore, and a calendar invite for a preliminary acquisition discussion set 2 weeks out. I didn't have to wait long. Within days, HR's Golden Digital team accidentally forwarded a fragment of the client's supposed financials to the wrong address, one I'd planted specifically to catch them in the act. Less than 24 hours later, Tyler Voss, the junior board member with his venture capital friends, routed the same information through one of his shell companies. They were biting hard. It reminded me of a stunt I'd pulled back in my early years, when a rival firm tried to poach one of my clients. They'd spent months whining and dining the guy, convinced they could undercut my numbers. So I let them steal a deal, a massive logistics contract I'd fabricated from the ground up. The client didn't exist. The shipping routes were nonsense, and the margins were a death sentence. They closed the deal with champagne, only to spend the next quarter bleeding money into a black hole. By the time they figured it out, they'd gutted their budget and had to sell off half their portfolio. I didn't just win. I made sure they never came near my side of the water again. This was the same play, just scaled up. I kept the pressure steady, leaking negotiation updates in all the right places, always making sure the scent stayed fresh. I wanted them hungry enough to move fast, because fast decisions are sloppy decisions. The final bait was the meeting. One night only. Confidential location. No electronic invites. Just verbal confirmations and a courier-delivered packet with the agenda. I set it for a private conference space I'd rented under another name, a room I'd already outfitted with discreet cameras and mics. The agenda looked authentic enough. Introductions, review of current holdings, signature of preliminary contracts. Every fake document was detailed down to the watermarks, and every number was inflated just enough to make the deal look irresistible. The night came cold and sharp. I arrived early, made sure the coffee was fresh and the blinds were drawn. The place had the right hum, a little too quiet, the kind of space that makes people lower their voices without thinking. By the time the first car pulled up, I was in position. They came in dressed for success. Custom suits, polished shoes, the kind of watches you wear to let people know exactly how much time costs you. Voss was at the front, HR's pet hire right behind him, carrying a slim folder like it was the crown jewels. I saw the confidence in their stride, the assumption that they were walking into a clean kill. They spread out their forged contracts on the table, checking their watches like this was just another in a long line of easy wins. They didn't know the room was already wired. They didn't know that behind the mirrored glass at the far wall sat 3 of Franklin & Moore's senior board members, 2 of my oldest and most valuable clients, and a pair of federal investigators who'd been waiting for this kind of stunt to go live. Voss slid the contract across to me, pen poised. "Let's make this official," he said, leaning in with that too slick grin of his. And then the cameras flashed. Every head in the room turned as the lights along the perimeter came up. The mirrored glass became a window, and the observers stepped through the side door in silence. The investigators didn't waste time. They went straight to the table, collecting the contracts, sliding them into evidence bags, reading out rights in calm, measured voices. No one said a word to me. They didn't have to. Voss's grin cracked first, then his eyes flicked to the HR director, who was already pale and shaking. The walls they thought were closing in on me had just slammed shut on them instead. And we were only getting started. The room had gone still in a way that no one could mistake for calm. It was the kind of stillness that settles over a battlefield right after the first shot is fired, when everyone realizes the game they thought they were playing is already over. The HR director's smirk, the same one she'd worn across from me in that sterile little office when she called me old school, was gone. Her lips were pressed tight, her eyes darting toward the door like she might bolt if no one was watching. Tyler Voss sat slouched back in his chair, phone in hand, already scrolling through contacts in a desperate bid to get a lawyer on the line. His custom-tailored confidence was gone, replaced by the pallor of someone watching the walls close in. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke the way I used to when I walked a nervous client through a crisis. Steady, deliberate, every word landing with weight. "These," I said, tapping the folder in front of me, "are transaction logs from the last 2 quarters. You'll see the same shell entities appear over and over again, each tied directly to Voss's fund. You'll also notice the accounts targeted for digital migration match precisely with those shells' acquisition wish lists." I slid the next folder across. "And here are the internal emails showing HR's role in leaking confidential client data, including our fictitious mega client, which, just so we're clear, never existed outside of this sting." Across the table, one of the federal investigators took over, reading dates, account numbers, and cross-referencing the fabricated files with the intercepted communications. The sound of it was surgical, cutting away the last bits of denial. Every new fact landed like a hammer. The senior board members watched in silence, their faces hardening with each page turned. When the presentation ended, there was no need for debate. Evelyn Cho, sharp as ever, called for a vote. The decision was unanimous. Effective immediately, Voss was removed from the board, his access revoked. The HR director was terminated on the spot, escorted from the room without the dignity of a farewell speech. Neither of them looked at me as they left. I sat back, letting the silence breathe for a moment before speaking again. "I've also taken the liberty of reaching out to the clients you've lost in the past month. Most are willing to reinstate their contracts under the condition that the company returns to the service model they originally signed on for." I didn't add that all of those clients had made a point to tell me they'd only said yes because it was me on the other end of the call. That part didn't need to be public. Richard Grant, the chairman, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Thomas, we owe you an apology. More than that, we owe you this company's future. We'd like you to come back. Name the terms. Anything you want." His voice carried the weight of sincerity, but underneath, I heard something else. Desperation. For a moment, I thought about it. About reclaiming the office I'd built my career in. About walking those halls with the authority to undo the mess they'd made. But the thought evaporated just as quickly as it came. The company I'd given 25 years to didn't exist anymore. Not really. The business world I'd grown up in, the one built on trust, on handshakes, on knowing the people behind the contracts, had been eroded by metrics, dashboards, and executives who thought relationships could be digitized. I'd proven my point, but I had no interest in living inside the ruins. I shook my head once. "No, Richard. I think we're done here." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just nodded slowly, the kind of nod that comes when you realize you're losing something you can't replace. I stood, gathered the folders, and handed them back to the investigators. My work here was finished. The rest, the cleanup, the legal fallout, the inevitable press leaks, wasn't my concern. The clients who mattered knew the truth. That was enough. When I stepped out of the boardroom, the building felt different. Not lighter, not warmer, just emptied. The kind of place that had already started erasing me before I'd even walked out. I didn't mind. In my jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper with a list of names. Every one of them was a client I trusted, and every one of them had agreed to take my call when I was ready to talk about what came next. I didn't take the elevator. I walked the stairs down to the lobby, each step quiet, deliberate. Outside, the night air was cool, the streets damp from an earlier rain. I stood for a moment at the curb, watching the reflections of the city lights ripple in the pavement, and thought about the future. Not theirs, mine. They'd wanted me gone. Now I was gone. and so was their future.